so much for that introduction, Mara. It is really wonderful to be here with all of you. And I can't tell you how excited I am to learn this material together. It's material that I think is super important in general, but it's also material that has changed my own life. It's changed how I think about Judaism. It's changed how I think about the world. And it certainly changed how I think about Purim. And I want you to know that when I first learned this, I found it shocking myself. I did not expect to find what I'm about to share with you, but it came about because I was really trying to understand the origins of the custom of drinking on Purim. And where it led me, and where I will hopefully lead all of you, is to a place that I really could have never expected. So I'm very, very excited for you to join me and for all of us to embark on this journey together. So in order to begin, I really want to see where we're all at in terms of this material. And so I'm going to share my screen for the duration of this presentation. I might stop it at some points. But we're really going to be addressing a few key questions here. And to see where we're all at, I want to begin with some assumptions that we have going into this. And so I'm going to ask Mara to share a brief poll on the screen. And I would ask that everyone fill out this poll so we can see what our assumptions are coming into this conversation. Take a moment, just read through the questions and answer them as close as possible to what your answers would be. It might not be exactly what you're thinking, but as close as possible to what you think the answer would be. We'll take another 30 seconds or so. And then once we have all the responses, we'll share them out so we can see where everyone is on this. Okay, so if we have a significant number of responses at this point, I think we can share what we have.
Yes.
All right, excellent. So our first question, why is there a custom to drink on Purim? By far, the number one answer here is because it's a happy day. Then we have coming in second to remember the role of wine in the book of Esther. And then finally, in last place, to help us understand Purim more clearly. Moving down to the next question. Mordechai was, and I know the title of this lesson together sort of did the opposite of burying the lead, but we had only 8% saying that Mordechai was a villain. We had 64% saying he was a hero of sorts, and 26% saying he's an average guy, and only 2% saying who's Mordechai, which will be helpful because it means that a lot of us are familiar, but I want to reassure you that those of you who asked who's Mordechai, we're going to try to address that and offer as much background setting as possible. Finally, our last question of Mordechai bowing down to Haman or Haman would have been, and here we have the largest plurality or majority of answers saying that it would have been idolatry. We had a small percentage saying 16% saying it would have been wise for him to do so. And then again, 2% we're not all on the same page of who Mordechai was, so we'll make sure to address this. So this is really helpful for understanding what our assumptions are coming into this conversation. So those were our questions about our assumptions starting this. Now, all this ties to the question of this custom that exists of drinking on Purim. And I included this picture, not because this is indicative of all of what Purim is about, but some of you may have noticed that there is a custom that exists where people get incredibly drunk on the holiday of Purim. And I noted here that this is in many ways really unlike many other Jewish holidays. If you look through the Jewish calendar or Jewish life generally, intoxication is not something that is usually celebrated or held in high esteem. There's a lot in Jewish text, in Jewish tradition, that actually speaks very poorly or negatively of drinking in excess. And yet on Purim, there is this custom that exists of really taking things to excess and drinking excessively. So the question is, where does this come from? And that question is what really bothered me starting 20 years ago. And I really wanted to understand what this was all about. So if you ask most people, the answer is pretty straightforward. It's what we have over here, which is that we have in the Babylonian Talmud a statement that a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until one does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. This right here, this statement in the Talmud, is the origin of the custom of drinking on Purim. Now, for many people, the question of why do we drink on Purim, this statement asks and answers the question because it says so in the Talmud, that one should drink until they can't distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And based on this perspective, it seems very obvious because, as we'll see in a little bit, the generally accepted view is that Haman is the villain, Mordechai is the hero. And so if there's an instruction to drink on Purim until not being able to distinguish these two people, that must be a lot of alcohol, because how else could you not distinguish between the villain and the hero of the story? Now, there's some further explanations that later commentaries on the Talmud give as to why this statement was given. And we saw some of those in our testing of assumptions before. Some of them say, well, Purim is such a joyous holiday that we just need to get really intoxicated. Some people say that the story of Purim, as we'll see in a little bit, involves different stories of feasts, of wine, of drinking. And so this is a way of recalling that. But usually the answers stop about there. And I want to note that there's something a little bit missing in some of those answers, because first of all, even though Purim is a joyous holiday, we have many joyous holidays throughout the Jewish calendar year. And generally, the custom is not to drink in excess in this way. And there are other stories in Jewish tradition as well that involve alcohol in some way. And there too, we don't have this custom. It doesn't exist. And so I think one of the critical pieces that is important to emphasize, and something that often gets underplayed, is that the Talmud isn't a monolithic work. It's a collection of the statements of hundreds, over 1,500 different rabbis, spanning a large period of time. And the Talmud goes to great lengths to record who says what. And part of what is so important about this statement is that it's not anonymous. We know who said it, and that person was Rava. Now, who was Rava? His actual name was Abba ben Yosef bar Chama. He lived around the years 280 to 352 CE, so around 1700 years ago. He lived in Babylon, which is roughly around modern day Iraq and Iran, in the cities of Machoza, Sura, and Kumbedita. And also, it's important to know that he is one of the most cited rabbis in the Talmud. And one of the things he did was that he regularly disagreed with another rabbi whose name was Abaye. So that's who he was. Now, once we have that as background, once we know that this is who made the statement, we can try to understand why he made that statement, which is different than saying, why does the Talmud make the statement? Because the Talmud contains views from over 1,500 different rabbis. But when we're able to zero in on Rava, we can begin to investigate why Rava would have said something like this. And one of the first things that we come to when we start looking at it through the lens of Rava, and I'm just pulling up this next slide, is that elsewhere in the Talmud, he tells us a little bit more about what his view on alcohol is. And elsewhere in the Talmud, what Rava said is that wine and good sense, which is kind of incense we might be talking about, they make me wise. They make me see things more clearly. The Hebrew word here is, or the Hebrew verb is pikeach, which is a way of referring to seeing things clearly. And so Rava is saying that when he thinks of drinking alcohol, it's a way to see things more clearly, to see things in a wiser way. Now, that is very different than the way we often think about or talk about drinking on Purim, which is this point of inebriation where you can't make distinctions, where everything is blurry. Rava is telling us that for him, drinking is a way of actually seeing things more clearly. So now let's go back to his actual statement with that in mind. So Rava said, a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until that person does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Now, if the goal is to see things more clearly, this gets really, really confusing. How would it be, or why would it be, that we would want to drink alcohol to see things more clearly, and the thing that we're seeing more clearly is a blurring of lines between cursing Haman, cursing the villain of the story, and blessing Mordechai, the hero of the story? So that is something that we really need to understand from Rava's perspective. But in order to make sure that we're all on the same page with our background, I know there were some questions before about who is Mordechai, where does he fit into all this? I want to share a brief little summary of the Purim story, which is recorded in the book of Esther, as it's generally told, because that will be some important level setting so that we understand who Mordechai was, who Rava was, and why Rava might have said that he wants people to use alcohol to see more clearly so that they won't see a distinction between these two characters. So I'm going to pull up this video, and hopefully it will work that everyone can hear the sound, and we'll see how this goes.
There once was a king named Achashverosh who threw a wild party that lasted for, get this, 180 days. Achashverosh called for his wife, Vashti, to appear in her royal crown because he was so proud of how beautiful she looked. Guess what? She refused. Not because she minded the attention, but because she wasn't looking great that day. Now, what's a king without a queen? And our king needed a new one, so he dispatched guards to find him a fitting wife. Eventually, they found a Jewish girl named Esther, who had been adopted by her wise and learned cousin Mordechai. Mordechai advised her to keep her Jewish identity a secret. Of all the maidens, the king chose Esther to be his queen. Worried about his cousin, Mordechai hung around the palace to make sure she was okay. That, coupled with the fact that he knew tons of languages, allowed him to overhear two bad guys, Bigtan and Teresh, plotting to kill the king. He had Esther tell her husband, and the day was saved. But all was not well. The king had an advisor named Haman, who was evil. Like, really evil. He wanted everyone to bow down to him, which pretty much worked, except for Mordechai the Jew, who insisted that he bowed to no one other than God himself. Haman was mad and convinced the king to hold a giant Kill All the Jews Day, which he determined by picking a lot, which is called a Purim in Persian. Mordechai found out and told Esther, who agreed to talk to the king about the issue, as long as everyone would fast and pray for her, which they did. Esther approached the king and invited him and Haman to a private party. At the party, she invited them to yet another party. Haman felt pretty good, until he bumped into Mordechai. Haman's wife, who was an even bigger creep than he was, told him to build a giant gallows upon which to hang Mordechai. Meanwhile, the king could not sleep, and he asked that his royal records be read to him. What do you know? The reader read about how Mordechai saved the king and had never been rewarded. And what do you know? Who walks in? Haman, eager to tell the king about his plot to hang Mordechai. Bam! The king told Haman to honor Mordechai by parading him around town wearing the king's robes, sitting on the king's horse. It gets better. That night, Haman arrived for the party, and Esther spilled the beans. She was Jewish, and Haman was trying to kill her people. That did not end well for Haman. And the day when Haman's lotto picked to kill all the Jews ended up being the day the Jews neutralized their enemies. And the day after is celebrated as Purim. Lots. Yeah, okay, so that...
Okay, so hopefully that is a brief refresher or perhaps a first-time introduction to the story of the Book of Esther. And we're going to be using that to unpack a bit more about Rava's understanding of the two characters in his statement about not drinking until one can no longer distinguish between cursing Haman and blessing Mordechai. So the first thing we're going to look at is really to understand why in the first place Rava could ever even imagine an equation between these two characters. So when we look at the Book of Esther, there's a few things I want to pull our attention to that Rava had really interesting interpretations about. And these are verses that we just saw referenced in that little video that captures the story of the Book of Esther. So the first one is the story of the king's feast, where the whole story begins. So if we read the story over here, this is from the Book of Esther. At the end of this period, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for all people who lived in the fortress Shushan, high and low alike. And we can skip to the end. Royal wine was served in abundance as befits a king, in golden beakers of various design. And the rule for the drinking was no restrictions. For the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with the man and the man's wishes. That's a literal translation of the Hebrew, kertzon ish va'ish, which literally means according to each person's wishes. Now, something that's important as background here is that almost universally in rabbinic literature, this party is treated as a really terrible place because, first of all, it was full of debauchery, but also when it refers to the different vessels that are used, the tradition is that those vessels were stolen from the temple in Jerusalem because the Babylonians the Persians had conquered the temple, and they were using these vessels to serve. And so actually in many congregations, when the Book of Esther is read out loud, the tune for this verse switches to a mournful tune because the idea is that it was such a sad and terrible party. So that's the verse as is. It's a pretty straightforward verse. But then when we get to the Talmud, elsewhere in the Talmud, Rava gives an interpretation of this verse. And what does he say? He says, when we read those words to comply with the man and the man's wishes, Rava commented on the literal meaning of the verse, which is referring to two men, a man and a man, and said, the man and man whom they should follow indicates that they should do according to the wishes of Mordechai and Haman. Now that's a bit odd. It didn't mention Mordechai and Haman. The two of them served as butlers in the feast. So he's saying that they were in charge of the wine at the party. Why is this verse interpreted in this way? And he gives a sort of Rava gives a sort of far-fetched reading. He says, elsewhere in the Book of Esther, Mordechai is called a man, which is not so surprising. Mordechai was a man. As it is written, there was a certain Jewish man in Shushan the castle whose name was Mordechai, the son of Yair. And then he goes, and Haman is also called a man, as it states, a man who is an adversary and enemy, this evil Haman. Now, this is a little bit of a stretched reading because there are many people throughout the Bible who are referred to as a man. And Rava seems to be going out of his way to not only equate again, as we saw in that initial teaching about drinking on Purim, but here too, Rava goes out of his way to equate Mordechai and Haman, and he does so through a pretty strained reading of the verse. Now, if we go on to another interpretation of another verse, we see things continue to get strange. So later on in the Book of Esther, when we're introduced to Mordechai explicitly, it says that in the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with King Yechoniah of Yehuda, of Judah, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now, this is a pretty straightforward background on who Mordechai was. He was exiled from Jerusalem. Here too, Rava gives an interpretation of the verse that is somewhat surprising. The verse stated with regard to Mordechai, and again, now we're looking at the Talmud's interpretation of this. The verse states with regard to Mordechai, who had been exiled from Jerusalem. Again, Rava, the rabbi that we keep referring to, said, this language indicates that he went into exile on his own, not because he was forced to. Now here too, this is certainly not a literal reading of the verse. The literal plain reading of the verse is that he was exiled, but here Rava gives a very strained reading to say that Mordechai exiled himself. So just to recap, just before we saw that Rava goes out of his way to give a strained reading to say that Mordechai and Haman were in charge of alcohol at this really problematic party. Then a second time, Rava goes out of his way to reread the verse that says that Mordechai was a sort of victim who had been exiled, to say that Mordechai voluntarily abandoned Jerusalem. Pretty striking thing to say. But that's not it. If we go to another verse, if you remember from the recap of the story that we just watched in that little video, at one night, the king cannot sleep, and he's reminded that Mordechai came to save his life. And that's really when things begin to turn in the Purim story in the book of Esther. And what happens is when the king wakes up and he asks to be read from his records to find out the story of having been saved, he asked this question of what honor or advancement has been conferred on Mordechai for this, the king inquired. And then we find out that his servants say nothing at all has been done for him, replied the king's servants who were in attendance with him. Very straightforward reading of this verse from the book of Esther is that this is really an opportunity for Mordechai, who was formerly unrecognized by the king, to now really become the hero and to flip the tables on Haman, who had been plotting this evil plot against him and against the Jews. But here too, when we go to the Talmud, we see another strained reading by Rava, which he says, the verse states that King Ahasuerus was told with regard to Mordechai, nothing has been done for him. But Rava said, it's not because they love Mordechai. It's not because Mordechai is so great that the king's servant said this, but rather because they hate Haman. So just from these verses, we're beginning to pick up on the theme that there's something strange or perhaps surprising about Rava's views of Mordechai. He keeps going out of his way to denigrate Mordechai in some way, even reading verses against the grain in order to do so. But why would he want to do something like this? We just saw that video that said Mordechai was a hero. He was this very proud Jew who refused to bow down to Haman, and therefore he eventually stood up for Jewish pride, and eventually that's what leads to the Jews' redemption, even though there was this plot to kill the Jews in between. So this is when we find Rava's most shocking interpretation of all. So if we go back to that initial verse we saw not too long ago, when Mordechai is introduced in the book of Esther, it describes him as both a Jew and a Benjamite. Now, just to give some context, the word Jew comes from the tribe of Judah. Jew comes from Judean, which comes from Judah. And so the verse here is describing Mordechai as coming from two different tribes. A Jew, on the one hand, the tribe of Judah, on the other hand, the tribe of Benjamin. So that's a little confusing. Which one was it? Did he come from the tribe of Judah or did he come from the tribe of Benjamin? So this is something that bothers the rabbis of the Talmud. And I want to read us through two different interpretations of how this is dealt with. So the first is not Rava. This is a different rabbi. Rabbi Bar Barchana said that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said an alternative explanation. What was the explanation for these two different identities? The first one is that Mordechai's father was from the tribe of Benjamin and his mother was from the tribe of Judah. Therefore, he was both a Benjamite and he was a Yehudi from the tribe of Judah. The rabbis say that this dual lineage is due to a dispute. They give a different explanation. The families competed with each other over which tribe should take credit for Mordechai. They both wanted to say that he was a hero and therefore he belonged to them. The family of Judah would say, I caused the birth of Mordechai. We're responsible for him. Why? Because King David did not kill Shimei, the son of Gera. We're not going to get into the whole detail here of this whole story, but Shimei, the son of Gera, was someone who tormented King David when his son Absalom was chasing after him, but King David never killed him. And Mordechai eventually descends from Shimi ben Gera. And so therefore it was only possible for Mordechai to be born because the Judean King David was from the tribe of Judah. So because King David never killed him, killed Shimi ben Gera, that's the only reason that Mordechai was able to be born. So that's why they're taking credit for him. And then he goes, and the family of Benjamin said in response, but in the end, he came from us. Shimi ben Gera was our ancestor, so therefore we're responsible for him. The important part here is that these rabbis are both saying that the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin are both really proud of Mordechai. They both want to take credit for him. But now we get our main rabbi for this class in the picture, Rava again. And Rava offers an alternative explanation. What does Rava say? The congregation of Israel at the time said this from the opposite perspective, not as a boast. They're not boasting that Mordechai was from them, but as a complaint. They're saying that they're upset that Mordechai was from them, remarking, see what a Judean has done to me and how a Benjamite has repaid me. What a Judean has done to me is referring to the responsibility of Judah, as David did not kill Shimi, although he was liable for the death penalty. The grave consequence of this failure included that Mordechai was born from him. So I want to pause there to highlight how extreme this is. Rava is saying that people that are coming from the tribe of Judah are saying that they regret that their ancestor never killed Mordechai's ancestor, because if he had only killed Mordechai's ancestor, Mordechai would have never been born, and that would have been a good thing. Let's take a moment to just let that sink in. Rava is saying it would have been good if Mordechai's ancestor would have been killed so that Mordechai would have never been born. And why was that the case? Because Mordechai was the person against whom Haman was jealous, leading Haman to issue a decree against all of the Jewish people. Then he gives another explanation of how a Benjamin might have repaid me, referring to the fact that Shaul, who was from the tribe of Benjamin, did not kill the Amalekite, King Agag, immediately, from whom Haman was later born, and he caused suffering to the Jewish people. We're not going to unpack this whole second part, but the important part here is that for Rava, both Mordechai and Haman, it would have been good if their ancestors had been killed. Now that is an extreme statement, because Rava is saying that both of these people, both Mordechai and Haman, are such villains that not only are they somewhat problematic, it actually would have been good if their ancestors had been killed so that they would never have been born. Now, this all boils down, as Rava says, to the fact that Mordechai was the person that got Haman upset. And why did he get Haman upset? Because Haman wanted everyone to bow down to him, as we saw in that little refresher of the Purim story. And Mordechai refused. Mordechai refused to bow down to Haman. But as we saw in our poll at the beginning of this class, well, why didn't Mordechai bow down to Haman? So I want to just pause here for a second. I'm going to stop sharing screen, and hopefully this will work. And I want to just open up the chat again for a moment. And I want to put in again, and this time, instead of going with the dedicated poll responses, I would love everyone to type in, why do you think that Mordechai refused to bow down to Haman? This is in many ways what brings about the whole Purim story to happen. It was only because Mordechai refused down to Haman that Haman gets so angry, and eventually leads to him making this decree to kill all the Jews. So I would love if everyone could put in the chat, why do you think that Mordechai refused to bow down to Haman? Great. So it would be like idolatry. Jews don't bow down to anyone but God. Mordechai was too proud to bow down. So we see it would be a sin because Haman was Amalekite. So we're seeing a lot of different ideas here. I would say the thrust, idolatry. Mordechai would just save the king's life. He deserved to become prime minister. It's personal. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of different ideas. Some of them are coming in now that he was proud. Okay, so we're seeing religious observance. Great. So these are all really, he was stubborn. Excellent. Okay, so I love the diversity of ideas. I'm going to ask that we just pause the chat again. This was great to get a sampling. We'll have opportunity, hopefully, at the end to dig in a little bit more with some more questions. But the critical point here is that we see a wide range of ideas. Now, I want us to walk through some critical ideas that I think are really important for understanding whether or not it makes sense, this idea for Mordechai to have not bowed down to Haman. So I'm going to again share my screen. And we're just going to have to cycle through these for a second. Okay, so the critical question here is, to bow or not to bow? Should Mordechai have bowed down to Haman? And I want to take us to the Babylonian Talmud, which cites this earlier rabbinic source. So this earlier rabbinic source, which we're about to read, dates to the early rabbinic period, somewhere between the years 0 and 200. It's taught in an earlier rabbinic source, you shall not bow down to them, which means you shall not bow down to them. That's a quote from Exodus. The way the rabbis interpret this is you shall not bow down to them, which means to other gods, but you may bow down to a person like yourself. So the early rabbinic sources are very clear unanimously. It's totally okay to bow down to another person. We see this throughout stories in the Bible all the time. When people meet kings, they bow down to them. When people meet important figures, they bow down to them. There's biblical story after biblical story where this happens, and it's not considered a problem. So at its face, the question becomes even stronger. What would Mordechai think that it would have been wrong for him to bow down to Haman? He's just paying respect to another person, which is something that is totally permissible. Now, the rabbis knew that this was a challenge. And so because they knew this was a challenge, they told a story, or the way they interpreted the book of Esther was that Haman wasn't just asking people to bow down to him as a government minister, but rather that Haman turned himself into a god of sorts, that he elevated himself to the level of a god. And therefore, it wasn't just that they were bowing down to another person, but they were bowing down to another god, which, as a number of people put in the text, would be a form of idolatry. Now, I want to note that that is not in a literal reading of the book of Esther. That's an interpretation that's brought up to sort of explain why Mordechai would have never bowed down to Haman. But even assuming that that is true, that Haman turned himself into idolatry, and therefore it would have been a form of idolatry to bow down to him, there's still another question that comes up. And that's the question of ranking of values. There's a critical question in Jewish life that there's a tension between two different principles. On one side is the principle of, and you shall live by them, which is that if someone's life is endangered, the general rule is no matter what the violation of the Torah is, it's better to violate the Torah if that means than to die because of that. So for example, it's better to violate the Torah and desecrate Shabbat than to die in order to observe Shabbat. Or it's better to, if the only way to survive is to eat some non-kosher food, it's better to eat non-kosher food than to die. That's one general principle. But there's another general principle which says there are a few exceptional mitzvot, there's a few exceptional rules that it's better to be killed or to die rather than transgress them. Now, there are two of those type of mitzvot, of general biblical rules that everyone agrees that it's better to be killed. And when I say everyone, that everyone in the Talmud agrees that it's better to be killed rather than transgress. And those two are murder and illicit sexual relationships. So to be very explicit about it, if someone comes over to someone else and says, if you don't kill this person, I will kill you, the Talmud's response is, you can't violate the rules of murder in order to save your own life, because who says your life is more valuable than the person you're going to kill? So that's one exception. The other exception is illicit sexual relationships. So for example, to take an extreme case, it would be impermissible to rape someone or to engage in familial sexual relationships that are prohibited by the Torah, rather than to be killed, because those are considered at such an important level that it would be better to die rather than transgress those. But there's a third category. So far we have murder, illicit sexual relationships. There's a third category that is often cited, but I want to highlight here is actually a little more ambiguous, and that is the question of idolatry. Now, if you ask many rabbis and you say, what are the mitzvot, what are the rules that someone should be killed rather than transgress? They'll say there are three: murder, illicit sexual relationships, and idolatry. What I want to point us all to now is that actually that third one is contested. And drum roll, please. If you want to guess who is the one who might contest this, it's Rava, our rabbi that we've been coming to all along. And I would want us to all look at where he contests this. So this is a bit of a long passage from the Talmud, and I'm going to try to go really slowly to unpack it because there's a bit of complicated ideas here. So here we go. It has been taught, if one engages in idolatry through love or fear of people. So fear of people would be the idea here that someone is threatening you. Someone is saying, if you don't worship this idol, I'm going to kill you, for example. But the person being threatened does not actually accept the divinity of the idol. Abaye, and just to bring us back, Abaye is Rava's main counterpart. He's the main rabbi that Rava disagrees with. Abaye said he's liable to punishment, which means Abaye said, you can't worship the idol even though someone is threatening you. That's still not okay. Even if you don't believe in the idol, doesn't make a difference. But Rava said he is free from a penalty. Rava said it's actually permissible. And why did Abaye rule that it's not okay? Since he worshipped it. For Abaye, it's just about the act. If you bow down, you bow down. It doesn't make a difference what you believe inside. That is prohibited, and that counts as one of the three things that it's better to be killed rather than transgress. But Rava said that he is innocent. Rava said that it's allowed. It's only a problem if he accepts it as a god. For Rava, the problem with idolatry is not about some external form of bowing down. It's about what's going on inside your heart. And so even though someone is forcing you to do this act, unless it's in your heart that you actually believe that this idolatry is idolatry, you're actually just doing some physical act that doesn't mean anything. And therefore, if we go back to our weighing of the two principles, it's better to live than to be killed and transgress, because you're not actually transgressing anything. You're not actually worshiping idolatry if you don't internally in your heart believe in the thing. But now it's where it gets really, really tricky, or not even tricky, but this is where the meat comes in. Abaye said, so this is the one who believes that it's actually impermissible to worship idolatry, even in that case. He goes, what is the source for my position? It has been taught in an earlier rabbinic source, and this is the rabbinic source we just saw. You shall not bow down to them. You shall not bow down to them means to other gods, but you may bow down to a person like yourself. And then in this earlier rabbinic source, I only cited an excerpt before, but in the continuation of the earlier rabbinic source, it says, could a person like Haman therefore be worshipped? They ask the question very explicitly. Can you worship a person like Haman who makes himself into idolatry? And then the continuation of the verse in the Torah teaches you may not, and you shall not worship them, teaching that you can't worship someone like Haman. So Abaye thinks this is a very strong case in his strong proof text for him. It says explicitly, you can't worship a person like Haman. So after bringing his proof text, Abaye explains how this rabbinic source proves his point. He says Haman was worshipped through fear. Haman was threatening Mordechai that he would kill him if he didn't bow down to him. And this earlier rabbinic source says that even so, you can't worship someone like Haman, which means that this earlier rabbinic source held that it was prohibited to bow down to him, even though it was done in fear. So Abaye thinks he has a slam dunk here. He has an earlier rabbinic source, which says explicitly that Haman, who was worshipped through fear, can't that it's impermissible to bow down to him. And he thinks that this disproves Rava's point. But we now have to give Rava a chance to respond. And we're in the final paragraph here. Rava responds by reading the earlier rabbinic source differently. How does he read it? So he focuses in very specifically to what that earlier rabbinic source said. The earlier rabbinic source didn't say, could Haman therefore be worshipped? Could Haman therefore be worshipped? Rather, it said, could a person like Haman be worshipped? So how does Rava read this? The prohibition in the source only applies to someone like Haman, but not altogether like Haman. To bow down to one like Haman is forbidden, since he set himself up as a divinity. So what Rava is saying is, if Mordechai actually believed that Haman was a god, then of course Mordechai couldn't have bowed down to him. You can't bow down to a person who you actually believe is a god. But the prohibition only extends to someone not altogether like Haman, for Haman was worshipped through fear. And in the case of Mordechai, it was a voluntary action. So what does that mean? I'm just going to really try to bring this point home, that according to Rava, the way he's reading this verse, this earlier rabbinic source, is that it's only prohibited to worship someone like Haman if you're doing so voluntarily. But the aspect that is not like Haman is that because Haman was under coercion, under duress, it was permissible for Mordechai to bow down to him. And not only was it permissible, but if we go back to this earlier slide, Mordechai was actually required to bow down to Haman, because there's a general idea of you shall live by them, that it's better to transgress things than to violate them because of the value of human life. And if Mordechai if Mordechai was being threatened, then it falls into this category as opposed to the other category of being killed rather than transgress. So this throws things in a radically different perspective than we could have ever imagined, I think. It's certainly shocking to me that according to Rava, Mordechai actually made the wrong choice. That not only did Mordechai not do what he was supposed to do, but by not doing what he was supposed to do, he endangered his own life wrongly, and he endangered the lives of the entire Jewish people. So where does that lead us? We saw before that some people said, why didn't Mordechai bow down? Because he was proud. So here's another place where Rava rereads the book of Esther. The verse in the book of Esther says, but it seemed contemptible in his eyes, this is talking about Haman, to lay his hand on Mordechai alone. For they had made known to him the people of Mordechai, wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout this whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordechai. So Rava now reads this in an interesting way. He said, at first, Haman wanted to lay his hands on Mordechai alone, and in the end on the people of Mordechai. And who are the people of Mordechai? They were the sages, Mordechai's special people. And ultimately, he sought to bring harm on all the Jews. So again, here, this is not a literal reading of the verse, but Rava goes out of his way to say there were stages involved in Haman's plan, in Haman's plan. And at each of those stages, Mordechai had the opportunity to back down from his stubbornness and to recognize that he should do the right thing of bowing down to Mordechai, to Haman, to save his own life, then to save the lives of the rabbis, and then to save the lives of all Jews. Now, if we read this in conversation with some of the earlier interpretations we saw before of Rava's, why might Mordechai not have bowed down to Haman if he was just being stubborn, if the right thing to do would have been to bow down? So we saw that the initial verse about the party, according to Rava, Mordechai and Haman were both government ministers at the party. They were both sort of equal government ministers. So if we read the book of Esther through Rava's eyes, the story starts with Mordechai and Haman being on equal footing, and then the king promotes Haman, and effectively Mordechai is just jealous. This becomes a petty dispute about power, about who gets to bow down to who. It's not about religious devotion. It's not about pride. It becomes about pride. It's not about religious pride. It becomes about personal pride. And therefore, Mordechai, because of his own personal ego and because of his own personal pride, not only risks his own life wrongly, but he risks the lives of all the Jewish people. Now, if we look at the story of the book of Esther and this whole story of Purim through the eyes of Rava, this leads to a drastically different understanding. How drastic is it? If we look at this question of, is Purim joyous? The general way we mark a Jewish holiday as being joyous is through the recitation of a special prayer called Hallel. But on Purim, we don't recite the prayer of Hallel. So the Talmud tries to understand this. So we're going to see a few different views here. Rav Nachman, who's a different rabbi, said an alternative answer as to why Hallel is not recited on Purim. And he says the reading of the Megillah itself is an act of reciting Hallel. So according to this interpretation, Purim is super joyous, and the way we show it's joyous is by reading the book of Esther. But Rava said a different reason why Hallel is not recited on Purim. He goes, yes, Hallel is said over there on the holiday of Passover, when we recall the exodus from Egypt, as after the salvation there, they could recite the phrase in Hallel, give praise, O servants of the Lord. After their servitude to Pharaoh ended with their salvation, they were truly servants of the Lord and not servants of Pharaoh. But can it be said here, after the limited salvation commemorated on Purim, could we really say, give praise, O servants of the Lord? Which would indicate that after the salvation of the Jewish people, we're only servants of the Lord and not servants of Achashverosh. Rava says no. Even after the miracle of Purim, we were still the servants of Achashverosh, as the Jews remained in exile under Persian rule, and consequently the salvation, which was incomplete, did not merit an obligation to say Hallel. So if we see it through Rava's eyes, not only is Purim a more complicated holiday, it's not even a super joyous holiday. Because what's the story? Mordechai, the whole thing that happened was Mordechai allows his ego to endanger all the Jews. He gets us into huge trouble. And at the end of the day, we're saved from this huge trouble, but we don't experience a massive salvation where we're freed from Persia and return to the land of Israel. All that happens is we're spared the problem that Mordechai caused us in the first place. So this is a really radical rereading of the story. And now we can understand why Rava would say, if we come back all the way to his initial statement, that a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until one does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Mordechai and blessed is Mordechai. For Rava, the goal of wine is to help you lower your inhibitions so you can see difficult truths more clearly. As we saw before, he says, wine and good sense make me wise. What is the wisdom that is so difficult for us to see? The idea that somehow the person that we thought was the hero is actually a villain, and the day that we thought was joyous is actually problematic. That is a very hard pill to swallow. And a little bit of wine, a little bit of some substance to help us lower our inhibitions or our defenses around that understanding, and around the understanding that actually the right thing to do would be to bow down to a person who, even though we have an ego strife with, even though we're jealous of them, it's not worth it to endanger our own lives, and certainly the lives of the entire Jewish people. That's a pretty radical statement. So I want to offer you this as Rava's understanding of the book of Esther, and the holiday of Purim, and I want to offer three main takeaways that I think are really important from this. So the first is that this is just one example of a really important rule in Jewish life in general, which is that rituals and norms reflect deeper philosophical concerns and worldviews. That often we see a prescription and we assume, okay, it says to do X, or it says to do Y, or it says to do Z. And then it's just, oh, it's tradition. Tradition says to do this or that. But what Rava teaches us here is that almost all of these reflect deep philosophical worldviews. Some of these are deeply contested. And to really understand why we do certain things, we really need to unpack where these ideas come from. The second is that not all rabbis agree with each other. And this has led to disagreements about core issues like who are the heroes and who are the villains? How do we behave when one's life is threatened? And what does it mean to be a Jew? When do we stand up? When do we back down? The final lesson I want to offer is that for Rava, Purim was not a particularly happy day. And it's therefore ironic that his prescription to drink alcohol in Purim is now used as a sign of joyousness, when for him, I think it's pretty clear that it was actually a way of coming to a realization that this is actually not a very happy day. So I wanted to try to leave about 10 minutes, or a little less than 10 minutes, but leave some time for questions. And I'm going to stop sharing screen, and I'll let Mara mediate the questions, and then we'll try to answer as many of them as possible.
the video that we saw, we clipped it when when the Jews were then commanded or killed Haman and his followers. Is that also part of what makes Purim a sad holiday?
So it's a great question, and I want to note that I tried in this class to really stay as close as possible to Rava's reading. My goal here was not to offer a general reading of why the Purim holiday might be sad or why it might be problematic. I think there's plenty of reasons why we could do that. And I think there's ways we can implicitly understand what Rava means. But Rava gives us so much direct, explicit information about his views that I don't think we need to even hypothesize too much. So I think it's possible that maybe he was upset by that. I've never found anywhere where where Rava says explicitly that the killing of the non-Jews was what upset him. It's possible that's what upset him. We don't have direct proof of that, but there's so much of what we have direct proof of what he was upset about, that I really want to emphasize those things. And part of what the point I want to make in general here is that something I want to push back against, both in this year and in general, is that I think there's a general tendency in Jewish life, and I think it's broader in Jewish life, to try to flatten different perspectives so that they accord with our own. I think this is something we see in many different places, and I think that's why we often see the case of, well, if Purim is joyous, then there's no way Rava could have meant this thing because it disagrees with our assumptions. And so I think it's really important for us to really try to understand different perspectives on their own terms, even if they're not exactly aligned with our own, or they're not aligned with other perspectives in the Talmud.
Thank you. I liked this question from Ruth, who says both Rava and Abaye were fourth generation rabbis in Babylon. Could Rava be lamenting that he had not returned to Jerusalem, so he was still in exile?
I think that's absolutely the case. And I love the emphasis on the generations that they're a part of. I think that's certainly the case, that Rava for Rava, it's important to remember the entire story of Purim takes place basically in the place where Rava is living. Okay. It's not, we're in America and celebrating Purim. Rava is basically in the same geographic entity as the Purim story. So for him, it's a very live issue. The places, the names, these are all things he's familiar with. And I think it's very possible that he is looking around and saying, I know people like Mordechai. I know people who are trying to stick it to the non-Jews and are willing to risk the lives of, and there's other things in the Talmud which suggest that Rava felt that way. And Rava is trying to make a stance and say, you know what, actually, that's not the way to behave in exile. The way to behave in exile is that only on really two core issues do we need to stand up and risk our lives. And those are murdering and illicit sexual relationships.
Thank you. I think we have time for someone to actually share their question with their own voice. Would anyone like to raise their hand and ask maybe a final question? Carol.
So the question I have is, this entire conclusion of Rava's is predicated on the notion that living in the diaspora is bad, but he was living in the diaspora. Cyrus had freed all the Jews to not live in the diaspora, return from exile. So isn't there a discrepancy here in how he lived and what he was stating?
Sorry, can you just restate the last part of the question about Cyrus?
Cyrus enabled all the Jews to return from exile. Robert
okay,
chose not to.
Thank you. So a few points. So one, just historically. So yes, after the Purim story, there is a return to the Second Temple, but Rava is so much later that it's already actually after the destruction of the Second Temple. So even the Jews that were able to return for the building of the Second Temple, by Rava's time, they had already been exiled and were now living in exile. But I think there's a separate point that I also want to emphasize here, which is that there's two pieces to this about why Rava is not happy about the Purim holiday. One of them is exactly, Carol, what I think you're pointing to, that at the end of the day, the redemption is not so great because they're still stuck in Persia or in Babylon. And therefore, what's the great salvation that happens? We just were saved from death. That's one piece of why it's not happy. But there's another piece of why it's not happy, which is that the whole reason we got into this mess in the first place was totally unnecessary. It's not like we were just innocent victims, and I mean, the Jews were innocent victims, but it's not just like something came out of the blue and then the Jews were persecuted. According to Rava's reading, and again, I want to emphasize according to Rava's reading, the only reason this whole thing happened was because a very particular Jew who was very loud and proud about it decided to make a very big point of sticking it to this non-Jewish minister. And for Rava, that was the wrong decision. And part of what he finds sad about this whole situation is not just what happens at the end of it, but how we got into it in the first place.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I knew that we would have more questions than we had time for. I do think we can take one more if that's all right. Jeff. If we can.
Hi, thanks for taking the question. You know, I've long wondered whether Mordechai could be charged basically with prostituting Esther by having her marry a non-Jew whom she didn't have a relationship with in order to either advance the cause of the Jewish community or to advance his own interests. What did the sages say anything about that, whether it was permissible for him to do this?
So I love the question, and it's a great way to end. So I'll say two things about it. And it connects to what we were talking about before of really trying to stay close to what Rava said. And we can make hypotheses about what the sages might say more broadly, but if we stick to just what Rava said. So first of all, if we're not sticking to just what Rava said, there is a very, if we just read the text of the book of Esther, it's quite shocking, the discrepancy. When Mordechai says he isn't bowing down to Haman, the words are, ki higid lahem, he told them that he's Jewish. It's very explicit, he told them he's Jewish. When we look at what happens with Esther, it's very explicit. It says Esther did not tell them she was Jewish because Mordechai told her not to tell them she was Jewish. The contrast is shocking, that Mordechai is very loud and proud that his Judaism, but he tells Esther not to be Jewish, even though he knows, and this gets to your question, that she is going to have to engage. And again, this is trigger warning. I know we might not all agree with this, but according to the rabbinic view at that time, for Esther to have sexual relations with the non-Jewish king is one of those prohibited things that everyone is agreeing it would be better to be killed rather than die. So the contrast between those two is quite shocking from Rava's perspective. But now let's really bring it back to Rava and what Rava said. Rava actually addresses this question explicitly, because the Talmud elsewhere, and I didn't have time to include this slide, I wanted to make this give enough time for Q&A, but the Talmud asked the question, how was it that Esther was able to have sex with the non-Jewish king? That's one of the things that's explicitly prohibited. The Talmud asked this question explicitly. And there's one answer, Abaye, as we saw Abaye and Rava are the two counterparts. Abaye's answer is that, that Esther was passive. So she didn't really engage in, I'm sorry if this is too graphic for anyone, that she was sort of passive in the sex and therefore she wasn't engaging in it and therefore it wasn't violative of anything. But Rava gives a different answer. And I think we can understand Rava's answer a bit more now that we've seen everything. Rava's answer is that the reason it was okay for Esther to do this was because he gives this expression, Hana'at atzvan shani. It's different if the reason the non-Jew is asking you to violate these commandments is for their own personal pleasure. So the goal is not to get you to violate some Jewish law. The goal is really just for their own personal satisfaction. Then it actually becomes okay to violate those things. So what is not the murder piece, but even the sexual relationship piece. So now if we come back to Mordechai and Haman, again, if the whole reason in the beginning, Haman wants people to bow down to him is for his own egotism, it's for his own self-aggrandizement, that would fall squarely into Rava's exception of personal pleasure. And I think that Rava, in making that statement about Esther, is trying to highlight this hypocrisy that you just called out. That Rava is saying, yeah, exactly. For Esther, he was willing to have her sacrifice her body to do all these things. Mordechai was willing to let her do those things, but for his own self, he didn't. And I think that hypocrisy really does color Rava's reading very much of this whole story.
Thank you so much, Ayalon, and everyone for being here. I'm hoping that you can engage with Purim in a happy way, but also hold multiple truths that this is maybe a little bit more complicated than we first expected. So we hope to have you here next time. Chag Sameach, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.